Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Beto O'Rourke. How are you?
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you, Congressman. And you just pulled in back there, so.
Literally, just drove in. Very good to be with you all. How's everybody doing? Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for carving out the time. Again, we'll take some audience questions here in a moment, but I want to start with, because shortly after the shooting in El Paso, you shall we say, made some news, and you talked about this mandatory buyback program that you would implement if you were president. And I want to read some of the response from members of your own party. Senator Chris Coons, day after, Senator Joe Manchin a day after. First of all, we'll start with Senator Manchin. I think it was very harmful to make it look like all Democrats. I can tell you one thing, Beto O'Rourke is not taking my guns away from me. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, I don't know of any other Democrat who agrees with Beto O'Rourke. And then, of course, Senator Coons said that clip will be played for years at Second Amendment rallies with organizations that try to scare people by saying Democrats are coming from your guns. I wanted to give you an opportunity to either do over or clear up any confusion, or do you still stand by it?
No, absolutely I do. And I stand with everybody here. I stand with this country. I stand with Gabby Giffords, who came to El Paso, Texas, and met with the victims from that August 3rd shooting, one of whom is still in the hospital more than 2 months later. Testament to what an AK-47 and the round shot from that weapon of war will do to your body. I was just with another victim, Memo Garcia, who just came out of his 21st surgery last night. Both kidneys, this is from one round, both kidneys hit, his spleen, his gallbladder, his liver, his intestine in 3 places. And the guy is not yet through the woods. Meeting Memo, getting to spend time with his wife Jessica, who was also shot in both legs by a gunman with a weapon of war who killed 22 people in under 3 minutes. I'm standing with them. They ask me, how in the world can we allow this to happen in our country? And if it is wrong to sell AR-15s and AK-47s going forward, then it's also wrong for more than 10 million of them to be out there on our streets, in our homes, potentially used against us in Walmarts or in churches or synagogues or in concerts or in public life, really striking terror and fear into our fellow Americans. And I gotta tell you, I heard some of the comments made today on this stage. Those who are worried about the polls and wanna triangulate or talk to the consultants or listen to the focus groups. And I'm thinking about Mayor Pete on this one, who I think probably wants to get to the right place, but is afraid of doing the right thing right now. To those who need a weatherman, let me tell you that in this country, mandatory buybacks are supported by a majority of Americans. In Texas, a proud but responsible gun-owning state, more than 49% of my fellow Texans support that. Only 36% are opposed, and that is with no national politician talking about this, no money being spent in favor of that proposition. So to Chuck Schumer and Chris Coons and Mayor Pete and others, not only is it the right thing to do, not only will we save the lives of our fellow Americans, our fellow human beings, the American people are with us on this issue. It's time to lead.
From a practical standpoint, though, how would you enforce that? I mean, what happens to folks who do not offer their assault weapons up for the buyback?
So here we are, almost 2 years from the massacre in Las Vegas. Under this administration, bump stocks were banned, and not just banned for sale, banned to be owned in this country. What we expect of our fellow Americans is that when something like this comes into law, that they will follow the law. And not just Democrats, but Republicans, independents, gun owners across this country, specifically for weapons of war, designed, engineered, sold to the militaries of the world because they are excellent, devastatingly excellent, at killing people efficiently, effectively, in as great a number as possible on the battlefield. Last week, I was in Dayton, Ohio. In under 40 seconds, 10 people were killed by one of these weapons of war. AR-15 owners have approached me in airports, in public restrooms, true story, in Katy, Texas, out on the street, in the grocery store, and they say, look, I own an AR-15. I've used a version of this when I served in Vietnam. I don't need this to hunt. I don't need it for self-defense or protection in my home. It's fun to shoot at the target range, but I would gladly and willingly give this weapon up, sell it back to the government, or destroy it, because this is part of the problem. And Beto, what you said on that debate stage, hell yes, we need to buy back these AR-15s and AK-47s. He said, that's exactly how I felt and precisely what this country must do. But listening to people like Rhonda Hart, or Manuel and Patricia, or others who have survived or have lost family members to gun violence, sitting down in Denver, Colorado with Sandy and Lonnie Phillips and others who have more basis in this than almost anyone else in this country. Listening to them, being driven by them, fearing their judgment more than I fear any poll, any outcome in any election. Lonnie said to me, Beto, you've really stepped in it. But you've stepped in it with all of us, and I want to know, are you in this all the way through to the very end? And Lonnie, to all of you, the answer is yes. We're in to the very end. Absolutely.
So you disagree with your fellow Democrats who say that Beto O'Rourke in that moment made it more difficult to reach any sort of compromise on common sense gun reform legislation?
Yeah, I very strongly disagree with them. The polls, if you need them, support this, but the people who we listen to are demanding that we do the right thing. And really, we have allowed, present company excluded, the NRA to dictate the terms of this debate, what we're allowed to talk about. We don't even have data from the Centers for Disease Control because Congress, complicit in what the NRA was able to purchase in influence and access and outcomes, prohibited the CDC from being able to do that. So the terms have been set long before we arrived. The game was rigged. It's time to move outside of those rules that were paid for by the gun lobby. In fact, a gun lobby that has also purchased impunity and immunity from the consequences of their actions and the firearms that they are selling right now. So who cares what the NRA, the gun lobby, those who stood in the way for progress for so long have to say about it? I care about what you have to say about it, what you care about, and what we can do together. That's what I'm focused on.
We've talked a fair amount so far about mass shootings, but the reality, as you know, is that roughly 4 in 10 children and teenagers in this country, 4 in 10 are killed by guns. Not at schools, not at the Walmart or the nightclub, but in their own home. And oftentimes those cases are connected to domestic violence. What do we do about that?
A couple of ideas. We know that universal background checks, that close all loopholes, the gun show loophole, the boyfriend loophole, the Charleston loophole, make it harder for those who should not have a firearm to obtain one. It'll save lives, and we know that from looking at those states that have adopted universal background checks. Red flag laws, where someone who poses a danger to themselves or someone else and they have a firearm, they're stopped, that firearm is taken before it is too late, before they use it on themselves or someone else. And then banning these weapons of war. But we have to your point, and to the point that I heard loud and clear when I visited Chicago and listened to this extraordinary group called Iman, which is an inner-city Muslim action network that intervenes before violence takes place. They're in the schools, they're out on the streets, they're working with young men primarily, but families, neighborhoods, communities, to make sure that they make a difference before we ever get to a point of violence. Our proposal to address gun violence, severely reduce it, end this epidemic in America, significantly funds those kind of intervention programs that we saw with Iman in Chicago. I also met with Purpose Over Pain. These are mothers who have survived the death of a loved one, very often their son. Many of those murders never fully investigated. The perpetrators never brought to justice. I think about Pam, who was the leader of the group that I met with in Chicago. The story of her son, and it wasn't sensational, and it wasn't in a mass shooting. And it wasn't with an AR-15, every bit as important as anyone else's child, any other story that we could listen to. So we need to invest in those solutions as well, listen to those mothers. And then I've got to bring this up because Pam introduced me to a friend of hers, another member of Purpose Over Pain, whose son was shot by a police officer, shot with complete impunity. Her son was not armed, posed no threat or risk or danger or violence to that officer or anyone else. In fact, was trying to flee from that officer when he was shot. Left on the ground for 13 hours before his body was recovered. So we also have to think about gun violence when it comes from those who are entrusted to serve and protect our fellow Americans. No one should fear law enforcement or police in this country, and so there has to be accountability for that. And I should say on this, and I think we're all thinking the same thing, we are grateful for the verdict rendered in the Botham Jean case in Dallas, Texas. There is no impunity for members of law enforcement. There's going to be accountability and justice.
Who should have the constitutional right to bear arms?
In general, every American should, to hunt for self-defense, for legitimate purposes to own a firearm. That excludes the need to own an AR-15 or an AK-47. But specifically, we must exclude those who pose a danger to themselves or a danger to someone else in their lives or a danger to someone else in our lives. So, I mentioned the boyfriend loophole earlier. What does that mean to people? It means right now in this country, if you do not have a legal relationship with a woman or a man, and you have abused them, you've beaten them, you've threatened them with violence, that may not be a material factor when you are purchasing a weapon and undergoing a background check, as limited as those background checks are today. In some cases, you must both have a legal relationship and be cohabitating with the person in question. So ending that loophole means that we end the ability for someone who poses a threat known to be correlated and connected with the use of violence and killing someone with having a firearm in this country. So certainly there are people who, through their history of violence, through their challenges with mental illness, should not be able to have or use a firearm in this country. But I want to make very clear that I hope we all understand our constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights, but we do not think that those Second Amendment rights trump our right to live, or for our children to live without fear in this country. Somebody shared this with me. It may have been when I met Lonnie and Sandy, but when the Second Amendment was adopted and ratified, it took 3 minutes to reload a musket. 3 minutes is all it took to kill 22 people in El Paso, Texas, and to grievously injure dozens more. And you listen to the doctors and the trauma-based surgeons who have treated these patients, some of whom have served in combat, in battle, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and they tell you what they're treating is very much like what they treated out on the battlefield. I mentioned that round that traveled through Memo Garcia's body and hit almost every internal organ that he had. It is designed to do that, to keep that enemy soldier down on the ground, to make sure that he never gets up again. And we're using that against people, humans, in Walmarts. Right after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, I was in a very conservative part of Texas. I was in Wichita Falls. And a Vietnam-era veteran came up to me and he said, I had a weapon much like the AR-15 when I served in Vietnam. I know what that can do. That young man in Florida, he told me, was better armed than I was when I was in combat, when I had a helmet on my head, when I was fighting in a war for this country. Those kids running in those hallways were absolutely defenseless against something that was designed to kill people out there, not here in our homes, in our classrooms, in our lives. So I think it's really important for us to remember that when we're talking about the Second Amendment, when we quote Antonin Scalia, not a bleeding heart liberal by any account, very conservative jurist and Supreme Court justice who himself agreed that there are some understandable common sense limits to the Second Amendment. And the people here in the room, those marching for our lives, those moms who demand, Gabby Giffords, Brady, all these organizations are making sure that we make that common sense definition together. And I'm feeling very optimistic about our ability to do that.
How about we take a few questions from the audience here. And let's start with Fatima Loren Mohammed. She's the executive director of the Health Alliance for Violence. Oh, there you are, Fatima.
Hey there. Do you want my microphone? Yeah. There you go. Yeah, you got it. Thank you, nice to meet you. Yeah. I'll come back and get it.
Okay. Sharing is caring, Fatima.
Sharing is caring.
Sharing is caring.
Congressman, the experience of daily gun violence for boys and men of color in many communities is severe and tragic. Hospitals see thousands upon thousands of gunshot wound victims a year, and unfortunately, for many, what follows is PTSD, being shot again, or even retaliatory violence. Violence begets violence. But we know there are ways to break the cycle that are evidence-based. I'm with the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, which represents innovative public health programs all over the country that bring hospitals and communities together to provide comprehensive care for victims that help break cycles of violence. But these programs are woefully under-resourced. How do you propose to support the expansion of these life-saving violence reduction strategies in our nation's most impacted communities?
Fatima, thank you for the question. And you're so right to force us to think about those, in addition to the 40,000 of our fellow Americans who are killed every year, the tens of thousands more who have survived gun violence and live with the physical wounds of it, but also live with the mental trauma of gun violence. And that includes those who were shot at or who were shot, but also those who just live in communities and neighborhoods where this is a daily occurrence or a daily fear. I mentioned working with Iman in Chicago, meeting with Purpose Over Pain just right across the street in the same community, listening to those young men every single day leaving the home. They're taking their lives into their own hands and very often feel like they must arm themselves to protect themselves, cannot rely on law enforcement, feel like they are forgotten if they were ever known in the first place. That violence intervention program that has been so successful, yes, let's make sure that we fund it, but let's also fund the mental health care that they are going to need to recover from the trauma that they've experienced. Let's invest in those schools to make sure that we have excellence and world-class instruction in the classroom, but also the kind of behavioral and mental health care help that children as young as 4 or 5 years old are going to need. In some specific neighborhoods, literally every single day, and then in other neighborhoods, and I think about El Paso, Texas, given what they have just experienced, more than 80% of Hispanics in Texas fear that they will be a victim of a mass shooting driven by hatred and racism and intolerance. That fear is going to do something to you if left untreated, especially if we do not make a major course correction when it comes to our gun laws in this country. So you asked about funding in our administration. We will make sure that we fund this commensurate with the need and make people whole, healthy, get them back on their feet again to live their full, best lives. Thank you for asking the question. Appreciate it.
You mentioned Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the March for Our Lives movement. Our next question is going to come from one of the co-founders of the organization. Oh, there she is. There she is. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all know Emma Gonzalez.
Nice to see you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm also a little sick, as we mentioned before, with Castro, so So hi. Part of March for Our Lives' peace plan, which you have endorsed, and we're very thankful for that, endorses a specific faction that I'm losing the word. I'm sorry.
You're good.
thing, that the president will appoint a director of gun violence prevention. How would you go about making this happen, appointing one person dedicated to managing multi-agency coordination in the fight to end gun violence, and keep it inclusive and not just focused on mass shootings?
Yeah. Emma, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you and March for Our Lives. I mentioned Manuel and Patricia, others who literally came to El Paso. Manuel and Patricia were there the day after. You were there actually on the day of the shooting. You were in Ciudad Juarez, crossing back over into El Paso, Texas, and then spoke to our community from experience with a connection that really no one wants to have. My friend Rhonda Hart texted me that same day. She lost her daughter, Kimberly, at Santa Fe High School, and she said, "You are now a member of the shittiest club in the world." And yet, you used that connection to send strength and love and power and help and support to our community. And in the Oliver family's case, literally to come to our community and speak to us and to be with us in the wake of that tragedy. And then this bold plan for peace in the United States of America, which in addition to everything that we just described, and includes gun licensing and a mandatory registration, invests, to Fatima's question, invests in those communities who are living with the daily trauma of gun violence. Something so numbingly common in their neighborhoods, it does not make the headlines, doesn't make the newscast. We don't know all the names of all the victims, of all the people whose lives were lost. We want to make sure that we invest in them. And having one person in our administration who is both responsible and accountable for this, and this is something that we endorse as we endorse all of March for Our Lives plan, is going to make it possible for us to make sure that we're delivering the care, the resources, the help to where it is needed. You ask how we will choose that person. I'm really going to rely on you and March for Our Lives, who came up with this idea in the first place, to make sure that we have the best advice and counsel. And this is one of the things I'm reminded of when I think about and look to American history. You might wonder, if we've made no progress over the last 30 years on gun violence, what's different about today and this moment? And I really do think it is you and other young people who are at the forefront of this battle. If you look at any time in America's history where we have faced an otherwise intractable challenge or an existential threat, it's always been the young people who have led, who sacrificed, and who have served. FDR was a president during World War II, but it was 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds who crossed the channel and landed in Normandy on those beaches, many of them never to return back to this country, willing to make a sacrifice for America. It was young people in 1960 who left North Carolina A&T, went to the Woolworths, and integrated that lunch counter, risking arrest, risking humiliation, risking the ridicule of their fellow Americans to stand up for all of us, shocked the conscience of this country, inspired other young people like the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. It is thanks to them that we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And I really do think, because of those who are here today, especially the youngest among us, that all of the things that we have talked about not only are possible, but we will be able to achieve them. And we will not be prevented by fear of what is or what is not politically possible, or what is poll tested, or what is popular at a given moment. We're going to be moved by the moral compass that you have been so brave in displaying for all of us. So that's the very long answer to the question. The short one is I'm going to pick up the phone and call you and ask for your help to do this. So thank you, Emma. Very, very grateful to March for Our Lives for everything you all are doing. Thank you.
Congressman, I want to come back to something you just alluded to there, the national gun licensing aspect of your plan. Senator Booker was here a few hours ago, and basically, to paraphrase what he said, he basically said you kind of took that idea from him, and that you came around on a national gun register. Is that accurate?
I will say this. I want to give Senator Booker all the credit in the world for being a leader on this. This is not a moment to seek division. The fact that we are on the same page on this issue, the fact that he's joined, really, I was going to say but March for Our Lives leadership on a mandatory buyback for AR-15s and AK-47s, that's a really good thing. and a very good sign, not just for our party, but for our country. We talked about what is politically possible. We've seen, just over the last few months, the ground shift, the center of gravity move so much further into the direction of common sense gun policy. So, to me, no me importa. It doesn't matter how soon you get to a given position, as long as you're in the right place. And I'm grateful that Senator Booker is on the right place on so many of these issues. And whatever our relative positions are after the end of this election, I really do look forward to working with him and everyone else, anyone else on this, Republican, Democrat, independent. Before we are any of those things, we are Americans first, and we're going to start acting in the national interest. So grateful for what he's doing. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Beto O'Rourke.
Les agradezco. Thank you very much. Really grateful for what you all are doing right now. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you.
Should I take this back?
Yes.